The town of Bellwood wasn't special. It was the kind of place you drove through on your way to somewhere else, where the streets were quiet by 9, and the only notable attraction was an old, defunct movie rental shop at the edge of town. For 4 high school friends, though, Bellwood was their entire world. And like every other boring town, it forced kids to make their own fun. Max was the de facto leader of their group. At 17, he was sharp-eyed and quick-witted, with an adventurous streak that sometimes bordered on recklessness. He hated boredom more than anything else, which is why he was often the one coming up with harebrained schemes to entertain them. Sasha, his best friend since elementary school, was the skeptic. With her ever-raised eyebrow and blunt honesty, she kept the group grounded. She didn't shy away from calling out Max's impulsiveness, but deep down, she'd follow him anywhere, even if she'd never admit it. Dan, the joker of the group, masked his insecurities with humor. He could make anyone laugh, even when it wasn't the right time. His dad's garage was their unofficial hangout spot, stuffed with old tools and junk, a treasure trove for kids with nothing better to do. And then there was Nia, quiet and perceptive. She rarely spoke up unless it mattered. She was the artist of the group, always carrying a sketchbook filled with strange, vivid drawings. Her calm presence often balanced the others, especially when tempers ran high. The 4 of them had spent countless nights exploring abandoned buildings and searching for urban legends. So when Max suggested they check out the old Bellwood video store, no one hesitated. The building was a relic of the past. Its windows were boarded up, and the neon open sign had long since burned out. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing rows of dusty shelves and the faint smell of mildew. "Bet there's nothing but mold in here," Sasha muttered, pulling her hoodie tighter. "Bet you're wrong," Max shot back, his flashlight scanning the room. "Places like this always have something cool." Dan found the box first. It was buried under a pile of VHS tapes in the back room. A heavy, dusty thing with the words "Do Not Watch" scrawled across the top in faded black marker. "That's not ominous at all," Dan said, grinning as he held it up. "Probably some bad movie no one cared about," Sasha said, leaning against the doorframe. Max's eyes lit up. "Or it's something really freaky. Let's take it back to your garage and find out." "Maybe we shouldn't," Nia said quietly, her gaze fixed on the box. "What if there's a reason someone didn't want it watched?" "That's exactly why we should," Max countered, already grabbing the box. And like always, they followed. The walk back to Dan's house felt unusually quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and Bellwood's familiar streets were cloaked in shadows. Streetlights flickered as they passed, casting eerie pools of light that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "Feels colder than usual," Sasha remarked, pulling her hoodie tighter. "It's October." "That's normal," Max replied, though he glanced behind them as he spoke. They reached Dan's garage without incident, but the unease lingered. Dan flipped on the lights, illuminating the cluttered space where they'd spent so many nights. An old couch sagged against one wall, surrounded by stacks of tools, crates, and half-finished projects. "All right," Max said, dropping the box onto the workbench. "Let's see what we've got." Dan rummaged through the mess until he found an ancient VCR, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust. "This thing even work?" Sasha asked skeptically. "Only one way to find out," Dan replied, wiping it down. Max opened the box and pulled out the tape. It was unremarkable at first glance, just a standard black VHS, its label peeling at the edges. But the words "Do Not Watch" stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. "Still think it's just a bad movie?" Max teased, holding it up. Sasha shrugged. "Probably, but I'm not the one who's going to get cursed when we play it." "Relax," Max said, sliding the tape into the VCR. "It's just a tape." The machine whirred to life, and the screen flickered. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, words appeared on the screen in stark white letters. "Your fears are your prison. Open the door only if you are ready to face them." A low, rumbling sound filled the room as the words faded. "What the hell is this?" Sasha muttered, leaning forward. The image changed. A man sat in a dark room, his face obscured by shadows. His voice was a low whisper, but the words were clear. "They're watching. They know your secrets. Are you brave enough to see?" The screen went black again, then flickered back to life. What followed wasn't like anything they had expected. The tape didn't show a movie or even a clear story. Instead, it showed scenes specific, personal, and horrifying. The first image was of Max's childhood home, engulfed in flames. He stared at the screen, frozen. He hadn't told anyone in the group about the fire that had nearly killed his family. The second scene was of Sasha, a woman in black standing at the foot of her bed. Sasha's knuckles turned white as she gripped the arm of the couch. Next was Dan's room, with shadowy figures standing outside his window. He let out a nervous laugh, but his shaking hands betrayed him. Finally, the screen showed Nia's drawings. Every single sketch she'd ever made, even the ones no one had seen. But the lines on the paper were moving, twisting into shapes that stared back at her. "Turn it off," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. Dan hit the stop button, but the VCR wouldn't respond. The images kept coming, faster and more chaotic. The sound grew louder, an unbearable cacophony. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tape stopped. The room fell silent, except for the sound of their breathing. "What the hell was that?" Sasha demanded. Max stood, his jaw tight. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not over." The garage felt heavier after the tape stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the VCR. No one moved, their eyes fixed on the blank screen as if expecting something else to happen. "What the hell was that?" Sasha finally demanded, her voice sharp and trembling. "It's some kind of psychological thing," Max said, though his confidence was noticeably shaken. He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding their gazes. "Like one of those creepy internet games. It's meant to mess with your head." "That wasn't just messing with our heads," Nia said quietly. She was still staring at the VCR, her fingers clenched around the edge of the couch. "It knew things it couldn't possibly know. Dan chuklet nerfo usli. Come on, guys. It's probably just a coincidence. Old footage spliced together to freak people out. Like one of those prank videos." "It showed my sketches, Dan," Nia snapped, her voice cracking. "How would it know about those? I've never shown anyone some of them. They were in my private notebook." Dan's smile faded, and he glanced at the others. "She's right," Sasha muttered. "That woman in black. It's not a prank. I've been seeing her since I was a kid. She's not real. She can't be." "But she was there," Max said grimly. "Same with the fire. It knew." Dan looked around at their pale faces, his own nervous laughter finally giving way to fear. "Okay, but what does it want? I mean, it's just a tape, right? It's not like it can do anything." The lights flickered, and they all froze. "Tell me that was your dad's crappy wiring," Sasha whispered. Dan nodded quickly, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the workbench. "Maybe we should just get rid of it," Nia said, her voice trembling. "Take the tape and burn it." Max frowned, shaking his head. "What if that makes it worse? We don't even know what this thing is yet. We need to figure out where it came from first." "I'm with Nia," Sasha said firmly. "Whatever it is, it's dangerous. I don't want it anywhere near me." Dan hesitated, glancing at the VCR. "I mean, what if Max is right? Maybe we're supposed to watch the whole thing. Maybe it's like unfinished or something." "Unfinished," Sasha repeated, incredulous. "Dan, it just showed us our worst nightmares. What part of that makes you want to keep going?" Before anyone could respond, the screen flickered back to life. They jumped as static filled the screen, the volume rising sharply. Max lunged for the remote, but the buttons didn't respond. "Turn it off," Sasha shouted. "I'm trying." Max snapped, jamming his thumb against the power button. The static began to fade, replaced by an image of a dimly lit room. A figure sat in a chair, their face obscured by shadows. The figure's head tilted slowly, as if looking directly at the camera. "You watched," the voice said, low and distorted. "Now you see." The image cut to another scene, this time a dark forest. The camera moved jerkily through the trees, the light flickering as though the person holding it was running. The sound of heavy breathing filled the garage. "What is this?" Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. The camera stopped abruptly, turning to focus on a clearing. In the center stood a single, dark figure. Its body was unnaturally tall and thin, its face completely blank. "You cannot run," the voice continued. You cannot hide. It is coming. The screen went black again, and the tape finally ejected itself with a soft click. The silence that followed was unbearable. Nope, Sasha said, standing abruptly. I'm done. I'm not staying here for whatever this is. Sasha, wait. Max started, but she was already at the door. You want to keep playing horror movie hero? Be my guest, she said, her voice shaking. But I'm not sticking around to find out what it is. She pushed open the door and disappeared into the night. The others sat in stunned silence, the tension between them palpable. She's scared, Dan said quietly. We all are, Max replied. He turned to Nia, who hadn't moved from the couch. You okay? Nia shook her head. Something's wrong with this. It's not just a tape. It's watching us. Max looked at the VCR, his jaw tight. We need to figure this out. Burn it, watch it, whatever. But we have to do something. Dan glanced nervously at the ejected tape. Yeah, but maybe tomorrow. I think I've had enough for tonight. Max nodded reluctantly. Tomorrow. They left the garage together, the tension hanging heavy in the air. None of them noticed the faint glow of the VCR as they walked away. The morning after the tape's second viewing, everything felt off. The streets of Bellwood looked the same, the autumn sun casting long shadows over fallen leaves, but there was a tension in the air. Max tried to go about his day as if nothing had happened, but the memories of the tape stuck to him like oil. He couldn't shake the smell of smoke, the acrid, stinging scent of burning wood that seemed to follow him everywhere. Sasha wasn't answering her phone. She had left abruptly the night before, and Max couldn't help but feel responsible. Dan texted the group chat once, a nervous joke about cursed VHS tapes, but no one replied. Even Dan's humor wasn't enough to lighten the mood. Nia spent the day in her room, her sketchbook open but untouched. Every time she tried to draw, her hand froze. The tape had stolen her art, warped it into something alien. The faces she had seen on the screen stared back at her whenever she closed her eyes. That night, the real horror began. Max was the first to notice it. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the smell of smoke returned. It was faint at first, like someone burning leaves in the distance. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew stronger, filling his lungs with acrid heat. He sat up, his heart pounding. His room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of his phone screen on the nightstand. The smell was overwhelming now, and he could hear something, a soft crackling, like fire licking at dry wood. Not real, he whispered to himself. It's not real. But then he saw it. A flicker of orange light danced across the wall, followed by a shadow that didn't belong. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The fire was there, devouring the walls of his room, just as it had in the tape. Flames licked at his desk, his bookshelf, his bed, but nothing burned. The fire moved like a living thing, circling him, trapping him. In the center of the flames stood a figure. It was humanoid, but wrong, its body flickering like the fire itself. It raised an arm, pointing directly at him. You couldn't save them, it whispered. Max stumbled back, his legs hitting the edge of his bed. This isn't real, he said, his voice shaking. You're not real. The figure didn't move, but its voice echoed through the room. They burned because of you. Max closed his eyes, his chest heaving. When he opened them, the flames were gone. His room was silent, dark, and cold. Sasha's experience was different, but no less terrifying. She was walking home from her shift at the diner when she felt it, the weight of unseen eyes following her. The streets were empty, the only sound her sneakers crunching against the pavement. Then came the whispers. They started soft, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but they grew louder with every step. Sasha, the voice hissed. She froze, her breath catching. Sasha, it called again, more insistent. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The street behind her was empty, bathed in the yellow glow of a street lamp. But as she squinted into the shadows, she saw it. A figure in black stood just beyond the light, its face obscured by a dark veil. No, Sasha whispered, stumbling backward. You're not real. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its voice was soft but unmistakable. You left me. Sasha's throat tightened. You're not her. You left me, the figure repeated, its voice rising. You left me to die. I didn't, Sasha's voice broke, and she turned, running as fast as her legs would carry her. The figure didn't follow, but its voice stayed with her, echoing in her mind long after she reached the safety of her home. Dan's terror came in the form of shadows. He was in his room, headphones on, trying to drown out his unease with music. But even the loudest songs couldn't block out the feeling of being watched. He turned off the music and sat in silence, straining to hear any sound. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw it, a handprint on his window. Dan's room was on the second floor, and the handprint was too high to be his own. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the shape of the print was distorted. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. It's just condensation, he told himself. Just water. But then the handprint moved. It pressed against the glass, as if trying to push through. Dan stumbled back, knocking over his chair. Nope, he muttered, grabbing his phone. He dialed Max's number, his hands trembling. Nia's fear was more insidious. She woke in the middle of the night, her room bathed in pale moonlight. At first, everything seemed normal. Then she noticed her sketchbook. It was open on her desk, though she distinctly remembered closing it before going to bed. Her chest tightened as she approached it, the floorboards creaking under her bare feet. The pages of the sketchbook were moving, flipping on their own. When they stopped, she saw the face. It was one of the drawings from the tape, its hollow eyes staring back at her. You drew me, it said, its voice low and raspy. Nia stumbled back, her knees hitting the edge of her bed. No, she whispered. You're not real. The face twisted, its lines shifting and warping on the page. You made me real, it hissed. And now I'm here. The sketchbook snapped shut, the sound echoing through the room. Nia didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, the four friends gathered in Dan's garage again. Their faces were pale, their eyes rimmed with dark circles. None of them had slept, and the weight of what they had experienced hung heavy in the air. It's not just a tape, Max said, breaking the silence. No kidding, Sasha snapped, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Something's following us now. I saw her, Max. She's real. I smelled the fire, Max said. I saw it. It was in my room. Dan nodet. There was something in my window. And Nia? She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. My drawings. They're alive. They sat in silence, the gravity of their situation sinking in. What do we do? Dan asked finally. Max stared at the VCR, his jaw tight. We go back to where we found it. We figure out what this thing is and how to stop it. Expanded Part 4, the second viewing. The next night, the group returned to Dan's garage, the weight of their fears pressing down on them like a physical force. None of them wanted to be there, but they all knew they had no choice. Whatever was happening, it had started with the tape, and the answers they needed were somehow tied to it. The VCR sat on the workbench, its dark, unassuming presence far more menacing than it had any right to be. Max picked up the tape from where it had been lying since the night before. The words "do not watch" seemed to taunt them, daring them to look again. Are we really doing this? Sasha asked, her voice tight. We have to, Max said. If we don't, this thing isn't going to stop. Or it gets worse. Nia murmured, her arms wrapped around herself. Dan glanced between them, his usual grin nowhere to be found. We've already seen the worst, right? I mean, how much worse can it get? Max didn't answer. He slid the tape into the VCR and hit play. The static returned, louder this time, the screen flickering as though the machine itself was straining to show the images. Then the same ominous message appeared. Your fears are your prison. Open the door only if you are ready to face them. The words lingered longer than before, and a low, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through their chests. I hate this already, Sasha muttered. The screen changed, showing the same dark room as before. The shadowed figure was back, seated in the chair, its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. You have returned, the voice said, low and distorted. The door is open. The image cut abruptly, replaced by scenes that sent chills through each of them. The first was of Max, standing alone in the ruins of his childhood home. The fire was alive now, its flames consuming everything around him as he screamed for help. The next scene showed Sasha's fear, the woman in black. She wasn't standing still this time. She was moving toward the camera, her veil lifting slowly to reveal nothing. Her face was a void, a swirling mass of blackness that seemed to suck in the light. Dan's scene came next. The shadowy figures weren't outside his window anymore. They were in his room, standing over his bed. Their hands reached out, claws forming from the darkness as they closed in on him. Finally, the screen showed Nia's sketches again. The faces weren't just moving now. They were speaking, their hollow voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "Turn it off," Nia shouted, her voice breaking. Max grabbed the remote, but the VCR wouldn't respond. The images grew more chaotic, more violent. The flames in Max's scene roared higher. The woman in black loomed larger, and the shadowy figures stretched unnaturally tall, their limbs bending in impossible ways. The sound built to a deafening crescendo, and then silence. The tape ejected itself with a soft click, and the room fell deathly quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. "We shouldn't have done that," Sasha said finally, her voice trembling. "It's worse now. I can feel it." "We had to," Max insisted, though he didn't sound convinced. "We need to understand what it wants." Dan sat heavily on the couch, his face pale. "I don't think it wants anything. It's just playing with us." "It's not playing," Nia said quietly. "It's feeding." They turned to her, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What do you mean?" Max asked. "The tape," she said, her gaze fixed on the VCR. "It's alive. It feeds on fear. The more we give it, the stronger it gets." "That's insane," Sasha snapped. "It's a piece of plastic, Nia." "Is it?" Nia countered, her voice rising. "You saw what it did. You felt it. Tell me it's just a tape." Sasha didn't respond. The garage door creaked open, and a cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. "What was that?" Dan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Max grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door, the others close behind him. The night outside was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows. "I don't see anything," Max said, shining the beam across the driveway. "Close the door," Sasha hissed. Before Max could respond, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Then the whispers started. Low and indistinct at first, the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The group huddled together, their breaths quick and shallow. "They're here," Nia whispered. "What's here?" Dan asked, his voice trembling. Nia didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the shadows that had begun to gather at the edge of the garage, shifting and coalescing into shapes that were almost human. "Get inside," Max shouted, slamming the garage door shut. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until the words became clear. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. Face what binds you, or be consumed." The four of them sat in silence, the whispers finally fading. "We need to go back," Max said suddenly. "Back where?" Sasha demanded. "To the video store," he replied. "That's where we found it. That's where this started. Maybe we can figure out how to stop it." "You're insane," Sasha said. "You want to go back to the place where we unleash this thing? What other choice do we have?" Max shot back. Sasha opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Fine," she muttered. "But if this gets worse, it's on you." The streets of Bellwood were silent as the group made their way to the abandoned video store. The chill in the air was sharper now, cutting through their jackets as though the night itself resented their presence. None of them spoke. The weight of what they'd seen and felt was too heavy for words. Each step felt like a march towards something inevitable. Max carried a flashlight, though its beam barely cut through the darkness. Sasha walked behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Dan and Nia trailed close behind, their eyes darting toward every shadow. When they reached the store, the sight of it sent a shiver through them. The boarded-up windows and faded neon sign seemed more menacing now, as if the building was alive and waiting for them. "This is a mistake," Sasha muttered, breaking the silence. We don't have a choice, Max replied, pushing open the door. The air inside was colder than they remembered, heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the aisles, the dim light from Max's flashlight casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Do you think it'll be here? Dan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It has to be, Max said, though he didn't sound confident. They reached the back room where they'd found the tape. The box was still there, sitting on the floor as if it had been waiting for them. But as Max bent to pick it up, the room shifted. The walls seemed to ripple, the shelves bending and twisting as if the building itself were breathing. Then the darkness closed in. The group was no longer in the video store. The world around them was unrecognizable, a void of black and gray where time and space felt meaningless. The ground beneath their feet was cold and uneven, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. What the hell is this? Sasha whispered, her voice trembling. The tape, Nia said, her eyes wide. It's brought us inside. Inside what? Dan asked, his breathing quick and shallow. Nia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The hum grew louder, and the void around them began to shift. Shadows formed in the distance, growing taller and darker with each passing second. The shapes were familiar, but wrong, distorted versions of the fears they had seen on the tape. Max was the first to react. The smell of smoke filled the air, and the shadows around him flickered with orange light. No, he said, his voice shaking. Not again. Max's fear. The fire roared to life, consuming the void around him. Flames leapt into the air, licking at his skin but leaving no burns. He was back in his childhood home, standing in the center of the living room as the walls burned around him. Max! A voice screamed, piercing through the roar of the fire. He spun toward the sound, his heart pounding. It was his mother's voice, just as he remembered it from that night. Mom, he called, his voice breaking. The flames parted, revealing a figure trapped behind a wall of fire. It was her, reaching out to him with tears streaming down her face. You didn't save me, she said, her voice filled with anguish. I tried, Max shouted, his hands trembling. I tried, but I couldn't. The fire grew louder, drowning out his words. The figure stepped closer, the flames curling around her like living things. You let us burn, she said. Max screamed. It wasn't my fault. He clenched his fists, the heat unbearable. It wasn't my fault, he repeated, louder this time. The flames flickered, the room trembling as his voice echoed. I couldn't save you then, but I can face this now. The fire roared one last time before vanishing, leaving Max standing alone in the dark. Sasha's fear. Sasha found herself standing in her bedroom, but it wasn't right. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to crawl along the walls. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The woman in black was there, standing at the foot of her bed. You left me, the woman whispered, her voice cold and empty. Sasha's hands trembled. You're not real. You're just a nightmare. The woman stepped closer, her veil lifting to reveal a void where her face should have been. You left me to die, she said, her voice echoing. You turned your back when I needed you. Sasha's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to stand her ground. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice shaking. I was scared, and I made a mistake. But I can't keep running from this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there. The woman stopped, her veil falling back into place. The shadows receded, and Sasha felt the weight lift from her chest. Dan's fear. Dan's world was nothing but shadows. They twisted and writhed around him, forming shapes that loomed over him like giants. You're nothing without us, one of the shadows hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Dan clenched his fists, his heart racing. You don't control me, he said, though his voice wavered. The shadows laughed, their forms growing larger. You hide behind jokes, they said, but we see what's inside. You're weak. A coward. Dan's breath quickened, his chest tightening. No, he said louder this time. You're wrong. The shadows moved closer, their claws reaching for him. You don't define me. Dan sho'ute. I'm more than my fears, and I'm done letting you control me. The shadows froze, their forms flickering like dying flames before vanishing completely. Nia's fear. Nia stood in a gallery of her own sketches. The walls were covered with them, every face she had ever drawn staring back at her. "You made us," one of the faces said, its voice hollow. "We are you," another added. Nia's hands trembled as she took a step back. "You're just drawings," she said. "You're not real." The faces twisted, their hollow eyes narrowing. "You made us real. You gave us life." Nia closed her eyes, her breath steadying. "I made you," she said, "and I can take you back." She opened her eyes and stepped forward, her fear giving way to resolve. "You're mine. You're part of me, but you don't control me." The faces blurred, their voices fading until the gallery was silent. The void around them began to dissolve, the shadows fading as each of them overcame their fears. They were back in the video store, the box lying empty on the floor. "Is it over?" Sasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Max said. The air was still, but a faint whisper lingered in the back of their minds. "It never ends." The video store was silent now. The oppressive weight that had lingered in the air was gone, replaced by a cold stillness that pressed against their ears. The group stood in the dim light of their flashlights, their breathing the only sound. Max crouched by the box, inspecting it as though it might still hold answers. The tape was gone. "It's over," Dan said finally, his voice trembling but hopeful. Max shook his head. "No, not yet." Sasha turned sharply. "What are you talking about? We faced it, didn't we? The fears, the tape. It's done. Then why does it feel like it's still here?" Max asked, his gaze sweeping the dark corners of the store. The others followed his lead, their flashlights darting over the walls and shelves. The shadows didn't seem as deep now, but the unease remained, a lingering reminder of what they'd seen. "We need to destroy this place," Max said, his jaw tightening. "The store, the tape, the box, everything." "And how do we do that?" Sasha asked, crossing her arms. "Fire," Max said simply. "Dan blinked." "Fire? You're serious? You want to burn the whole place down?" Max turned to him, his face pale but resolute. "This place is a conduit. It started here. If we destroy it, maybe we can stop it for good." Sasha hesitated, glancing at the others. "What if it doesn't work? What if we make it worse?" Max didn't answer. He didn't have to. The group left the store briefly to gather supplies. Dan found an old gas can in his dad's garage, and Max brought a box of matches from home. When they returned to the video store, the tension was palpable. "Are we really doing this?" Nia asked, her voice soft. "We have to," Max said. "We can't let it spread." They poured gasoline over the shelves and walls, the sharp smell filling the air. The store seemed to groan under the weight of their movements, as though it were alive and aware of what they were doing. When the work was done, Max struck a match. "Last chance to back out," he said, glancing at the others. "No way," Dan said, his usual grin returning briefly. "If this works, I'll be the first to cheer." "Just light it," Sasha muttered, her arms crossed tightly. Max tossed the match onto a gasoline-soaked shelf. The flames spread quickly, licking at the walls and shelves with a hunger that felt almost alive. The group backed away, watching as the fire consumed the building. At first, it was just flames and smoke, the crackling of burning wood filling the air. But then they heard it, the whispers. Low and faint at first, the sound grew louder as the fire raged. The voices were chaotic, overlapping in a cacophony of anguish and anger. "What's happening?" Nia asked, her voice trembling. "It doesn't want to die," Max said, his eyes fixed on the flames. The fire roared, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Shadows began to twist and writhe within the flames, forming shapes that were almost human. The figures from their fears, the woman in black, the shadowy creatures, the hollow-eyed faces, emerged briefly before dissolving into smoke. "It's fighting back," Sasha said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Just hold on," Max said. "It'll end soon." The fire burned for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. When the flames finally died down, the video store was nothing but a smoldering ruin. The group stood in silence, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the embers. "Is it over now?" Sasha asked, her voice hollow. Max didn't answer immediately. He scanned the ruins, searching for any sign of the tape or the box. There was nothing. "I think so," he said finally. The others didn't look convinced, but none of them argued. They parted ways that night, each returning home with a heavy heart. The events of the past few days had left scars, both visible and invisible. Max lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The smell of smoke still clung to his clothes, a reminder of what they had done. He wanted to believe it was over, but the whispers lingered in the back of his mind. Sasha sat on her porch, staring out into the darkness. The woman in black hadn't appeared again, but her presence still loomed. Dan tried to distract himself with music, but every shadow in his room felt too close, too alive. Nia opened her sketchbook for the first time since the tape, her pencil hovering over the page. She wanted to draw something new, something to prove to herself that she was free. But as the pencil touched the paper, the lines twisted into a familiar, hollow-eyed face. Days turned into weeks, and the group drifted apart. They didn't talk about the tape or the store, as though speaking of it might bring it back. But the memory lingered, an unspoken bond that tied them together even as they tried to move on. One night, months later, Max woke to a faint sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as he listened, his blood ran cold. It was the whispers, low and faint. They grew louder, forming words he couldn't escape. "It never ends." Max turned to his nightstand, his heart pounding. Sitting there, impossibly intact, was the tape. The end.